Okay, I think we can start. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending our virtual event today. I know that it's a very busy time of the year for many of you, but I'm sure today is gonna give us a very enriching discussion and a very engaging one. So our virtual event is on translanguaging and different multilingual science education contexts. And this event is organized by the International Committee at NARST. I'd like to start by introducing myself. I'm Christelle Fayad. I will be leading the event today. I've been a member of the International Committee for around 2 years now, and I'm a PhD candidate in science education at Texas Christian University, hoping to graduate this May. My colleague Arif Rachmatullah, who's the committee chair, has also helped me organize the event. So our virtual event is mainly gonna focus on the practice of translanguaging and different global multilingual science education contexts. We should be having 3 guest speakers who will showcase their research and their work in these different contexts. Each session is around 30 minutes for each guest speaker, and then we will reserve the last 25 minutes of the session of the virtual event for an open discussion and questions from the attendees. So before we start, I'd like to introduce to you our guest speakers for today. I will start by Dr. Enrique Henry Suárez. Thank you for taking the time today to talk to us about your work. Dr. Suárez is a professor at the University at Massachusetts Amherst. He's an educator and former astrophysicist. His research focuses on designing learning environments that leverage students' conceptual resources, translanguaging practices, and on supporting teachers and recognizing students' sense-making as intellectually generative. He partners with K-12 schools to co-develop professional learning and curriculum and has taught science method courses. He grew up in Venezuela and has lived across the US. Moving on to our second speaker, we have Dr. Erasmus Charamba from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Thank you, Dr. Charamba, for giving us a talk today. Dr. Charamba is a lecturer at the Foundation Studies Division at Wits University School of Education. His research spans language education, multilingualism, science education, decolonization, and teacher development. He teaches undergraduate and postgraduate courses in literacy, childhood studies, and educational theory, and contributes to the Wits Writing Center. With teaching experience at primary, secondary, and university levels in South Africa and Zimbabwe, Dr. Charamba is actively involved in research on early childhood education and widely publishes and presents in his field. We also have Dr. Sara Salloum, an associate professor of science education at Ohio University, Athens. Thank you, Dr. Sara, for being with us today. Dr. Sara's work focuses on justice-oriented science pedagogies that honor and leverage culturally and linguistically diverse learners, communicative and epistemic resources. Dr. Salloum researches building teachers' capacity for asset-oriented, transformative, and inclusive teaching and learning. Salloum is the international coordinator on the board of NARST and has presented her work at major science education conferences, including ESERA and NARST, and has published in high impact journal. We will start with our first speaker, Dr. Enrique Suárez. I will stop sharing my screen, and would you like to share yours?
Okay, can everybody see it okay?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Sara, for the thumbs up. And thank Christelle and Arif for the invitation. It's really exciting to be part of a session on translanguaging that NARST is organizing. I'm going to date myself here a little bit, but 15 years ago when I started, I don't think that this would have been possible. Like it took a while to for not only translanguaging to be taken seriously within the field, but really thinking about bi and multilingual students in a different way. So yeah, I don't know. I'm just filled with excitement and pride that this is kind of like where we are as a society. So thank Christelle, thanks Arif for organizing us and bringing us together, especially in the conversation with both Dr. Salloum and Dr. Charamba, and thinking of what does this mean globally. So yeah, this is really, really exciting. Thank you. So yeah, my name is Enrique Henry Suárez. I'm an associate professor here at UMass Amherst in science education. And I'm coming to you from the lands and waters of the Nonotuck, Potomac, and Nipmuc peoples in Western Mass, what we call now Western Mass in the Connecticut Valley. And my goal today is to share more a little bit of the work that I have done, that I've been doing, but to really push us to think a little bit more critically in what is it that we can reimagine as linguistic justice in science learning spaces. My work focuses primarily in PK5, so like elementary school, grades 1 through 5, 1 through 6, as well as the people who are teaching them and the people who will be teaching them, pre-service teachers, we call them in the US context. And I think as Christelle mentioned, the question that has guided most of my work for the past 15 years is, like, what is it that rich sense making looks like? And how is it that we may be misrecognizing the deep thinking that is happening within a person as we constrain what forms of talk we find acceptable? And for me, I always like to begin, at least in the space of the education system in the United States, recognizing that there are pressures around language and languaging that make it to where some people's forms of communication are more acceptable than others. And this is a historical process. This is not something new. We've, for the past 400 years, this has happened within the context of the Americas through colonization, where language and language policy has been used as a way of promoting the cultural and physical genocide of Native peoples. Even as recently here is kind of like an example from Hawaii, and all of the language policy that has existed for the past 150 years and how it has limited language and languaging. Residential schools are another example of how people's ways of communicating on native languages were limited in that space in ways that really deeply affected people and Indigenous people and First Nations people in Canada. But to me, this is kind of like, as represented here, it's a hydra, it's like the same monster with multiple heads. And it also like has a component that has to do with how we standardize English, and specifically white English, and what expectations we bring around anti-Blackness towards, Black children in schools. Some of you may not remember or may not have been alive by then, but the mid-1990s or 90s in general were filled with this kind of propaganda telling us that American English vernacular, African-American vernacular English was considered of a lesser kind, and it was actually doing Black children a disservice. It was hurting them. So part of what our goal should be doing is to like, again, assimilate them into quote unquote standardized forms of English. And it also is happening with children who are themselves migrants or from immigrant families, or even who's lived here in this territory for hundreds of years, and the border across them, where all of a sudden we are making policy and decisions around what forms of communication are not allowed. So like they're no longer able to speak Spanish, for instance, to the point where like my parents' generation, or what would have been my parents' generation here, were receiving corporal punishment for speaking Spanish in the classroom. And I bring all of these up because to me it's important to like recognize the context within which we are having this conversation within the United States specifically. I would argue that there are some similarities and patterns across the world, but specific to the United States. And it is in this kind of like sociopolitical context, and specifically within the system of education, that we have made decisions along the way around whose, again, languaging practices, ways of communicating are deemed as acceptable, as academic, as welcomed, and as not only that, but also fruitful. So part of what I've been doing, and there are beautiful colleagues who are doing this work alongside me, is really reimagine what these categories mean, and reimagine what's possible within the science classroom, and really move towards a more expansive version of how we can learn together and how we can make sense of and relate to the natural world. And to me, it was also, coming, as Christelle mentioned, coming from the experience of an astrophysicist. I've lived and worked in 3 different continents in multiple languages with multilingual teams. I started recognizing that English really had a hegemonic power over how we make science and who is allowed to be in science or STEM more broadly. And I think that this is a history that is fairly recent in terms of it started really with the Industrial Revolution. But since then, because of the English Empire and sort of like the US sphere of influence in the world, we have decided intentionally and unintentionally that English is the only way through which we can communicate, again, our understandings of the natural world. More recently, there's been more pushback, fortunately, for recognizing how this monolinguism in a way really limits not only participation, but the kind of science that we can do, what we can know, and whose knowledge are valued in that way. But again, to me, it's not just an issue of where we are in the US, but also as a field of science, what are we doing to recognize the power that English has and what it's able to accomplish, but also what limits. So it wasn't really surprising to me that when I started doing this work 15 years ago, the prevalent position was that if you were not an English speaker, then it was our responsibility to teach you English, because you couldn't do the science until you learned the English, because you didn't have the experience, because you didn't have the vocabulary. And if you didn't have the vocabulary, you didn't have a deep conceptual understanding. Things had changed by that, kind of like when I started a little bit, but still people were saying, like, okay, well, the children bring their own ways of communicating, their own kind of like words and slang and languages. But at the end of the day, our goal is to push them away from that and into science. Let's build on that, but eventually they'll leave it behind, because really these like academic forms of talk are what we value, are their way through which they can demonstrate the deep understanding or the deep conceptual knowledge that they have. But that to me felt insufficient. And if we were moving towards a conceptualization of science education where children are seen as agentive and where they can generate knowledge and co-construct knowledge together, then it didn't make sense to say, well, you leave that side of yourself at the door. Or kind of worse, that's a rudimentary stepping stone that we're going to have to leave behind somehow. You're going to have to leave behind somehow, because it's not doing you any service here in this science classroom. And I've been really inspired by the work that Beth Warren and Roseberry have been doing for 30 plus years at this point, and really pushing us to think about epistemic heterogeneity and recognizing that new forms of learning and new forms of becoming and being and knowing are possible when we bring together multiple ways of just existing and knowing and being and valuing, and recognizing from a very Freirean perspective that equity is not about sameness for everyone, but instead of recognizing that people have these potentialities and these futurities within them that we can help them achieve, again, if we invite them their ways of knowing in order to be able to like be valued. And to me, the move towards the science and engineering practices, again, within the context of the United States, from the National Research Council, that have guided a lot of what we do with the next generation science standards, really opened up a possibility for more of this epistemic heterogeneity to come through. Because if we are centering on the doing, if we're centering on the investigation, then the forms the knowledge take to me at least, become less relevant, and it's more about the content and about the depth. So for about 10 years, what has helped me figure out what this looks like in practice is the model of translanguaging that has invited me and my colleagues, hopefully, and all of us, hopefully, to move away from, again, the idea of the science vocabulary. Here is my mortal enemy, the word wall, that collects all of the science terms that kids should be using at all times. And it's this real separation between languages, between registers, and because these separations inevitably create hierarchies of power. And this is what the work of Ophelia Garcia has really helped me understand. It's like, how is it that we can move away from that separation, from those hierarchies that are really politically constructed? These are human-made inventions. These are not natural in any kind of way. And recognizing that instead of having these buckets that people keep at distance from each other, we have, represented by this cloud here, a broader repertoire. Initially, they called it a linguistic repertoire, but enough folks have really started to consider how other modalities like gesturing and drawing should be part of translanguaging practices. So in thinking of a broader semiotic repertoire that we have available to us, and we make decisions constantly, intentionally or subconsciously, about what resources we use for what purposes, with whom, and for and within which context. And I think, to me, also the work of Jonathan Flores and Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa is really important to remind myself that these are not just assets to build on, that are going to get left behind at some point, but instead really challenges me to recognize how my listening practices that are informed by my positions of power may also push me to misrecognize or ignore or prohibit some of these semiotic resources, again, because we may not consider them to be academic enough or productive enough for thinking about science. So I think that now there are more models about how to engage this and how to engage in translanguaging pedagogies. Even the WIDA, I never remember its name, kind of like what the acronym stands for. I think that they kind of dropped the name and they just call themselves WIDA now. But here in the US, it's been a very powerful document and consortium out of Wisconsin that has set policy. For a long while, they had models of academic literacy that were based on lexical structures and forms. I think that now they've recognized, or more recently, they've been recognizing translanguaging and multimodality as an important way of communicating. So we're making progress, I think. And to me, I think that the reason why it's important, or the reason why I keep coming back to it, is because, again, it's like I want to make sure that I have all of the analytical tools and pedagogical tools to get at the rich sense making that is happening in children and by multilingual children. So I'll share a few examples with you from, kind of like about 15 years of trajectory here. One is a case of third graders who were exploring a string instrument, and we presented them with that string instrument, and we just sort of asked them the question, what do you think is happening here? And one of the kids created onomatopoeias for describing the string and the sound that the strings were making, ting, tang, tong. And what we noticed was that the teacher, who wasn't me, encouraged that the use of the onomatopoeias. She sanctioned them as being productive. And what we saw was, across this conversation, all of the other students used the onomatopoeias themselves when they were sharing their thinking. By this point, the children had, or these kids had been introduced to terms like high pitch and low pitch, but they themselves sometimes couldn't quite figure out if something was low pitch enough to be considered that, or high pitch enough to be considered that. So the ting tang tong became like a receptacle for this conceptual understanding and their observation, and be able to communicate with each other in a way that allowed for very sophisticated physics to be done. We hadn't talked about tension before, but one of the students noticed that there was something here happening here with the tension of the string, and he was able to use ting tang tong to describe how if something was tighter, it was making ting sounds, and if something was a little bit looser, it was making tong sounds. Again, way beyond what we would have expected at the third grade level. Another example is thinking about how fourth graders are thinking about electrical resistance and about electricity. This was part of some work that I did that I was convinced that under the right circumstances, children would be able to explain electrical resistance beyond the binary between a conductor and an insulator. So I set up a program, and they were exploring, again, kind of like how electricity was moving through a circuit. And in this example, we see how if we just look at speech and maybe at the drawing, we get some information about how this student Yesenia was making sense of how electricity was moving through this, like a couple of circuits. But it is once we look at the speech in conjunction with her movements and how she's tracing the wires on the circuit. In this case, there were two circuits that were connected in parallel, that we can see, that I could see, that she was tracing how electricity was moving independently through these two wires coming out of a battery, or coming out of a battery. For a fourth grade level, it's good enough explanation. And it was sophisticated because it really animated how, for her, she was understanding these circuits to be working in parallel, having the same potential, but different electricity was moving through it because it had different resistance, because they had different light bulbs. And it was because she was able to like laminate these dimensions of speech and gesture that she was able to express that understanding. And if I had not had, or if we had decided that we wouldn't allow gesturing to be part of the work that she was doing, then again, we would have missed this deep understanding about circuits and how they are constructed, that again go beyond what a fourth grader tends to know. And a few sessions later, now we're getting into electrical resistance. And we were using conductive ink in a way that if you change the length or the thickness of the line, the brightness of the light bulb would change, which was a really phenomenal way of showing how the geometry of the conductor or the resistor really affects how much electricity goes through. I was really nerding out as a physicist in that time. But what was fascinating to me was that she was able to come up with a very sophisticated mechanistic explanation that accounted for the geometry of the conductor, of the thickness of the line, to be able to say there's more electricity moving through here, it's moving faster. But what was, in addition to like the sophistication of the physics, it was the way that she used both Spanish and English to share different layers of understanding about what was happening. And I talk a little bit more about this in this paper, but in Spanish, we have two versions of the to be verb, like the ser and estar, and ser is a lot more permanent and estar is a little bit more temporary, in the distinction that we don't quite have in English with to be. We would have to do a lot of languaging to be able to distinguish if it's a temporary state or a permanent state. But the way that she used these conjugations of a verb in Spanish, indicated that she understood that these were variables, and the variables were changeable, and she herself were able to create then, between her gesturing, between her languaging, and between her drawing, a more kind of like robust explanation around why is it that changing the thickness of the conductor changes how much electricity moves through it, or the brightness of the bulb. Again, this is like high school physics. I could not find, when I was doing this work, I could not find a paper below undergrad that looked at what children or youth knew about electrical resistance beyond it's a conductor, it's an insulator. So this, again, has really pushed me to think about how is it that heterogeneity is essential for supporting sense-making. Here there's a bunch of kind of like acronyms that have to do with our US context system and the NGSS. But I think for me, the big takeaway from here is that we should be creating spaces where we are challenging homogeneity of speaking, homogeneity of thinking, homogeneity of experiences, and instead reimagine like new spaces where this kind of multiplicity, where these kinds of variation are invited, are valued, are leveraged, not only because they help us to know the world better, but because they help us build solidarity with each other and say, hey, you are welcomed here. And we have to like recognize how we are working against this hydra that is constantly trying to push us towards assimilation. And instead, who you are matters, and who you are is valuable. And this, kind of like building on this work, I've had the pleasure of working with a few colleagues like Lama Jaber and Khadija Sohaib and Maria Gonzalez Howard to think about the implications for teacher education. So for the past year or so, we've been working together on analyzing some data that we have from our methods courses, and really posing the question of like, if we want future teachers to interact with this kind of work, if we want them to bring this.
Set a reminder for this summer, Sunday at 10 a.m.
Is that with us, Wendy?
Is that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I wasn't muted. Excuse me.
No, you're fine. That's okay. I was like, oh my goodness, it's going to be another virtual session about this. Wonderful. So we've been doing a lot of this work, again, in thinking about what can we do for our future teachers and teacher education courses. But I think that all of us bring a deep commitment to recognizing the strength that all learners bring to the science classroom. So rather than framing these pre-service teachers as deficient in some kind of way, as having some problems with how they think about bilingualism or multilingualism or translanguaging in their classrooms, we've been working hard to think about how we bring a different kind of framework that values and humanizes these pre-service teachers and recognizes, again, kind of like the strengths and the resources that they bring. So we approach this work from a situated perspective from teacher education, where we recognize that this learning happens in context, where part of the work is, if we're going to be training teachers for an equitable and justice practice and pedagogy, is be able to help them develop that political clarity around their pedagogy and their curriculum design. And also thinking about, like, what is it that we need to do in our methods courses that can really help them develop these orientations, develop these practices. So we are taking, or have taken, as I mentioned, like some of the data that from our methods courses. In this particular example that I'll be sharing, these pre-service teachers watch the video that I was telling you about a little bit earlier about the Ting Tang Tong, and they get to analyze it a couple of times throughout the semester, with the hopes that we get a snapshot of how they're thinking about these students' sense making and languaging at the beginning of the course, and then they do the reflection again. They watch and reflect again. And again, our hope is to, and through the course, is to help them develop this capacity for noticing, not just noticing the assets in terms of the science, but also noticing, again, kind of like the assets and the semiotic resources that are coming here. And it's been really lovely to work with them because they all bring, again, kind of like a similar commitment, but they bring also like their own perspectives on the things that they care about. So for the past year or so, we have been attending to the way that these pre-service teachers, in this case, somebody we're calling Lizzie, is attending to the conceptual thinking, the resources of the translanguaging practices that these children, multilingual children, brought to this case, or this video, this investigation. And what we're noticing is that the pre-service teachers at any point are, or as exemplified here by Lizzie, are very attuned to how the children are engaging with the string instrument and how they are attending to the science that they are co-constructing in that space. In this case, Lizzie was noticing that, again, the length and the tension and all of these characteristics of the strings were part of were important resources, instead of Lizzie saying, oh, that's not good enough, or that's not really scientific. No, again, really seeing the value in those ideas. Similarly, she was noticing how they were able to engage with each other, and they had all these sort of like metacognitive possibilities. And this was really encouraging because these are the kinds of things that we want future teachers to be able to see. It's just seeing the science in students' thinking. And then what was really interesting was that at one point, it's not highlighted here, but she mentioned that these students had a language barrier. And really, this was kind of like one of the things that galvanized the four of us to start thinking a little bit more deeply about what was going on here and why she would say that there was a language barrier. When she herself was recognizing all of these resources and all of these ways that the students were communicating their understanding and were investigating this phenomenon, or the sound production. When again, she was recognizing that these like onomatopoeias that the students were making were actually productive. So taken together, this paints a really interesting picture and a lot of tensions and contradictions within Lizzie, because again, we will recognize a lot of the kinds of noticings and the kinds of dispositions that we want to see in future teachers, and some of the other ones that we don't quite, or we would rather not see, again, kind of like the framing of a language barrier, because it says something about remediation that is needed within the child, as opposed to thinking more broadly about what's happening with the learning context. So we are, again, kind of taking an approach towards reconsidering how to make our pedagogies in the methods courses more humanizing, to where we can recognize these strengths, recognize these resources, and at the same time, we can continue to push them to consider more critically why they would call it a language barrier, and think about that sort of like that language ideology and disposition, to where by the time that they leave our courses, there is no longer a barrier there. There's nothing but resources and possibilities. So I think that a part of, again, what we're trying to do is really reconsider how we think about teacher education, and how we reconsider how we do teacher education for justice, in ways that, again, humanize our pre-service teachers and create more possibilities for them moving forward. And I think that, again, to me, this is all part of the agenda or the mission, which is getting us to think more critically about how we are seeing and valuing sense-making resources that all learners bring to the learning environment, where we're consistently striving for promoting sophisticated reasoning in all learners, and recognizing that engaging in these epistemic practices is important through creating learning environments where translanguaging is the norm, where homogeneity is the anomaly, and rather what we want to see is more of that heterogeneity. And finally, again, as teacher educators and as science education researchers, what are we doing with our own ideologies? What are we doing with our own methods? What are we doing with our own lenses through which we understand how people engage and interact? And yeah, that's kind of where we are. So thank you again for the invitation, Christelle, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A at the end.
Thank you, Dr. Suárez. I think now we can move to the presentation by Dr. Salloum, and then we'll leave the questions till the end.
Okay, hi everyone. How's everyone doing? I'm just gonna share my screen quickly. There we go. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I thought I was going third, but it's it's okay. First of all, thank you so much for organizing this, and thank you all for attending. I will be
Sarah, we are seeing the speaker version. If you could just swap the display, I think it will show us the
okay.
presentation. Like on
Oh,
top.
because let me try. Stop sharing. How about How about now? Are you still seeing?
Yeah, it's good now.
So are you seeing my screen or the other? Yeah.
No, it's good
Is
now.
it fine?
We can,
Is it good
yeah,
now?
it's fine. Yeah.
It's fine. Oh, okay, okay. Okay, again, so thank you so much for organizing this, and thank you everyone who's attending. I see a lot of like really dear colleagues, and it's always hard to come after Enrique Suárez because he's such a talented researcher, but I'm but I'm going to be I really get inspired by his work so much. And I will be talking about translanguaging in the Lebanese context, and actually in a lot of post-colonial context, because it is very similar to what happens in other parts of the world. And there's a specific reason that I called it an unfolding research story, because as Dr. Suarez just said, like 15 years ago or even 10 years ago, this was really something that we sort of noticed, but we haven't really thought that deeply about it. And in a way, my presentation now shows a bit that how did myself as an educator and researcher started developing the stance of what translanguaging is and what it looks like in different contexts. Before starting, I just want to acknowledge my wonderful colleagues that I've worked with on a lot of this research, and it's across different institutions in Lebanon and here in the States. So Dr. Salloum, who's with us, my student, I don't see her, but she's, she was my MA student and a collaborator, my colleague, Dr. Dani, Christelle, also lately we've been working on that, and Dr. Hokayim. I'm going to first give some background and talk about the Lebanese context again, and I think this is similar to other, especially post-colonial contexts. I'm just gonna set the time so that I don't go over. Um, and then I'm going to be giving a bit of background on translanguaging, which I think, Dr. Suarez did like a wonderful job at. So, and I'm going to talk about like some studies and that really show that progression that we have experienced, I think, a lot of us in the Lebanese context when we come to think about translanguaging. Now, to start with, as was mentioned before, multilingual settings, there's always a lot of class and racialized power dynamics and a lot of cultural tensions and linguistic tensions that challenge equitable education in general and science education in particular, because a lot of the multilingual context globally, the science and mathematics are taught in a language other than students or learners, multilingual's home language. So we have here that science teaching is intersecting with learning a second language, also with social justice, your socioeconomic status, and who you are, also like your identity. And there's always that backdrop of globalization and having an edge in a global society. And what does the second or international language mean to you and your career prospects? So this is something that is very important in a context like Lebanon. Now, as was mentioned, in a lot of post-colonial multilingual contexts, there's typically a very pervasive and a lot of times invisible legacy of language silencing, meaning mostly of the home language. And this is enacted through language and education policies that privilege and recognize certain knowledge and certain language choices, and it gives this status for other ways of knowing and other linguistic resources. It gives them like a lower status, as if they are less valuable for learning science, or like something that you have to leave behind, as was just mentioned. Now, because this is a personal sort of story, also, I wanted to share with you a couple of incidents of powerful recognitions that I myself have experienced, coming from a middle class background where my schooling was always multilingual, and I was, for different reasons, I was able to develop both, the languages Arabic and English simultaneously. So in a way, that sort of gave me a blind spot, and that's why I want to share with you the powerful recognitions that happened to me first as a master's student at AUB, at the American University of Beirut, where I was attending a science fair, and it was the first time that I see actually a poster of science in Arabic. And I was talking, so that she was a teacher from South Lebanon, a more rural area, and I told her, "Oh, so you teach science in Arabic." So for me, as someone whose Arabic is my heritage language, it was surprising to see science in Arabic. So that's also very telling, I think. And she told me, well, that was at the elementary level. She said, well, how will the kids go and tell their parents what they have learned in science? And that really struck me, and it stayed with me because it really showed me how I was really coming from that position where I really, I didn't really develop that language awareness, that and the politics and the power within language. Moving forward in our research later on, we would be researching, like, for example, an object of study that is different than linguistic aspects, but the deployment of multiple linguistic resources would come up. So, for example, in this particular study, there was a way where the teacher was talking collectively with the students, saying we, or in Arabic, nahna, that created this atmosphere in the classroom where they all were working together towards doing well in the national exams that happen at grade 9. So for those reasons, and against this backdrop, translanguaging really emerges as this pedagogy, this justice-oriented pedagogy that is boundary challenging among linguistic resources, that supports multilingual learners' meaningful engagement and learning in science, while also attending to their social and affective dimension of who they are and how do they experience science, and how are they made to feel in the science classroom about themselves and their resources. Also, I started understanding translanguaging also as a way to challenge the prevailing monoglossic and colonial outlooks that we have sort of grew up with, that typically belittle our different resources. Also, as a culturally honoring and humanizing pedagogy, more and more I started seeing that translanguaging disrupts and desettles expectations, assumptions that are implicit and hidden within dominant discourses in traditional classroom and a lot of post-colonial contexts. And in a way that sort of creates these porous connections between students' cultures, their knowledge, and science learning. Now, I want to give you, before talking about the research and going further, I would like to give you a bit of a background about Lebanon and its multilingual context. So, our educational system is multilingual. You start learning Arabic and another language, French or English usually, but there's other languages like Armenian. We also have schools that with other languages. And science and mathematics are typically taught in the international language. Most of the time, they're taught from elementary school. In some rural areas, they are taught in Arabic, but after grade 7, they all shift to the international language. And this policy is actually rooted in the country's geopolitical position. So that's Lebanon, that small very small dot over there. So it is, considered as a country of minorities, and also as sort of the crossroads between the East and the West. And we also have a legacy of missionary schools from England and France that started also coming to Lebanon since the 17th century. After independence, and we were a French mandate also, where the French became an official language for a part of our history. So this multilingual policy was actually maintained after Lebanon's independence, again, because of the globalization and also to reflect our multicultural identity. The policy itself is supported by many parents who see it as important to their kids' future aspirations. So it is something that a lot of parents feel actually strongly about. However, research shows, ours and others, shows that often economically marginalized learners, specifically in rural areas, and boys are disadvantaged by this policy, where there's a large dropout rate at grade 7, where the language of instruction becomes the international language. And this creates a large equity issue in a Lebanese context. Now, another thing about the Lebanese context is that we are also a pre-settlement country for refugees from the area. So, and we are considered we have the largest number of refugees per capita, meaning a country of around 5 to 6 million. We have more than 1.5 million pre-settlement refugees. The influx of refugees started in 1948 with Palestinian refugees coming to Lebanon and living in camps and attending schools by the United Nations. And more recently, the self-settled Syrian refugees. The reason I mention that is because some of the studies have been done with the Syrian refugee population. So against this backdrop, translanguaging is really very important in a context like Lebanon. On the one hand, we know that translanguaging is really about realizing justice, and it is about inviting and drawing on all multilingual learners resources and repertoires in an authentic way, whether it is the multiple languages that they experience, their everyday knowledge and practices, gestures, visuals, like just the different modalities that multilingual learners experience and live in. These resources and multilingual learners' identities are recognized and affirmed, while also acknowledging that our identities are also always evolving. So you live in one place and then you live in another place, and this does something and also changes you, and it changes the community. So students' agency through translanguaging is supported because they are authentically inquiring, they are co-constructing knowledge themselves, and they are sharing it with others by using really multimodal and multi-semiotic means, which I will mention a bit later. And in doing so, they are expanding their meaning-making repertoires. So when we think about science learning or translanguaging as a space for science meaning making, we know that for us to come to understand science, this is really a multilingual and multisemiotic and multisensory experience, because we are interacting with others, we are interacting with materials, we are also interacting with our own knowledge and what we have heard from our parents and our grandparents. So it is really a very dynamic practice. And through those dynamic practices, the multilingual learners, they problematize phenomena, they author ideas, and they do so both creatively and critically, which are two characteristics of a translanguaging space. So through the dialogic interactions that happen around phenomena, and I'll share some examples when we talk about research on that, they're creatively sort of blurring those boundaries and challenging those boundaries between what they know and what they are experiencing now. When they're doing this, they are really contextualizing science concepts in at a deeper level. And also with criticality, they're engaging in epistemic practices, they're questioning accepted knowledge, they're using evidence, and as importantly, it will open also spaces for them to explore social justice issues connected to science and to do this meaningfully in a way that is relevant to themselves and their communities. Now, a new area that I'm really interested in coming to translanguaging, so this is again part of my progression, is looking at the social and affective functions of translanguaging. And there's been research about that where it's considered that it reduces feelings of helplessness, anxiety, embarrassment when interacting in the classroom. And as importantly, it's initiating joy and wonder in science when you are able to engage all of your resources and bring your whole selves into the science classroom. So what are some, I mean, how does this look like in the science classroom, and particularly in classrooms like the ones in Lebanon or some of the post-colonial contexts that are around the world. To start with, I'm just going to go through some of the major theoretical frameworks that we have used in those studies that I will be talking about. There is, Bakhtin and the importance of dialogism and making those deep connections, but also because like everywhere, teaching is political, learning is political. We've used cultural historical activity theory to sort of also understand the larger context and, what are some of the sociopolitical or sociocultural contradictions or issues that also emerge. And as I said, lately we are focusing on how affect sort of permeates a translanguaging space. So we're looking at Vygotsky's Perezhivani, which is a less known legacy that looks at the affective or personal experience aspects and volition or the motivation to learn. So my first experiences with coming to know more about translanguaging happened in a study that I did that was looking at the Lebanese context and what are some of the contradictions or the constraints within the Lebanese context that might constrain translanguaging or creating translanguaging spaces in the classroom. And to do this, I used a chat analysis which proposes, human practices as goal-oriented. It looks at contradictions or tensions that would go between those different elements. So we might, we could look at translanguaging as a mediating artifact, or it could be an object itself because that it has that flexibility. Now, even though these are contradictions and tensions, but they can become impetus for change. And that is how the system is transformed, is by expanding the object and engaging in expansive learning. So from that research and by talking to other scholars, the certain contradictions were identified. First, the teaching methods are highly authoritarian. Language flexibility is seen by many as a deficit practice, especially teachers and school administrators. And there's really limited structure within the curriculum that is very test-oriented for teachers to work together like science and language teachers. The students themselves, though, they are resentful that they are not allowed to speak. So one of the rules in a lot of the specifically private schools in Lebanon is that you can only talk English in the science classroom. So a lot of the students actually resent that rule. So this is sort of like the backdrop. Now, after that, we started looking more at specific classrooms on a smaller scale where we developed curricula that really try to create aspects of a translanguaging space in the Lebanese context, considering the different constraints that are that are in place. Like, for example, the national exams are going to be in English. So it's, you know, there's a lot of sort of structural constraints that are there. So we started trying to see what, you know, how can we open translanguaging spaces in such a context. So in this study that is with my colleagues Christelle and Hayat, it was an inquiry curriculum around life cycles that also included purposeful spaces for the kids to leverage their multimodal and linguistic repertoires through engaging in active inquiry and given, you know, like told that they can deploy any linguistic resource that they have. And we tried to look at how the kinds of learning that occurred. So uh, again, considering that it's more of an authoritarian context in teaching, so the IRF discourse pattern was dominant, and the student, though, were doing a lot of peer-to-peer interactions around phenomena. So what was found there was that the teacher the teacher herself, she deployed English most of the time, especially when explaining or elaborating on concepts, because that was sort of what would be assessed. However, when she noticed that there was a misunderstanding or wanting the students to elaborate on their reasoning and on their work, she would deploy Arabic, and she would move flexibly between the two languages. So this sort of created like a divergent IRF pattern, and it allowed the students to leverage their linguistic resources by sharing observations and uh, you know, talking together. The students themselves, they found comfort in their home language. And here we wanted to focus on 3 students whose work would not have been noticed, whose thinking would not have been noticed because they were deploying Arabic most of the time. In a typical classroom, they might have been asked to speak in English, and they would have been silenced. So in a way, they would have been silenced. So we focused on their work, and we saw how they progressed in their understanding by deploying their home language. Another study that is more recent that we have done with a group of Syrian refugees in grade 7, where we also created a curriculum around respiration that was designed as a heteroglossic translanguaging space. Again, it focused on doing inquiry. And when I say inquiry here, also I need to talk about this in the backdrop of that there's a lot of traditional teaching that happens in Lebanon, more so than actually engaging in hands-on. So that in itself is also an important aspect that is very essential to creating a translanguaging space. There were more purposeful translanguaging because we had more leeway working with this particular population. And there was an aspect of repositioning the learners by engaging them in youth participatory methods, where they were giving feedback on the lessons, the materials, and how they would what else they thought they needed, and how to transform some of the lessons. And this is an example of some of the materials that the teacher created. So they could create like multilingual graphic organizers. There was also a multilingual formative assessment that had both languages. And here, one thing just to mention is also because a lot of the Syrian refugees in Syria, the science is taught in Arabic, so they actually come with a very strong background in standard Arabic or science in standard Arabic that a lot of times we don't have as Lebanese because we don't get exposed to it early on. And again, here we really saw how translanguaging really emerged as a justice-oriented pedagogy. It invited the students to bring in their experiences, but also of their parents, where they were asked to interview their parents about fermentation, for examples, and it validated their resources as important in the science classroom, like using the standard Arabic for different science concepts, and how the teacher and the students learned together. So this really fostered a lot of deep and dialogic connections that affirmed their outside social spaces. Now, the final study I'm going to be talking about is actually a follow-up to the study I just mentioned, where we wanted after a while to see, because we were interested now in more like the affective dimensions of creating a translanguaging space. So in this study, we interviewed the students and their parents more than a year after they have done that curriculum to see what really stuck, because the assumption is what you remember probably was associated with a stronger emotional experience. And of course, the background of this is that we think that whenever you are enacting a justice-oriented pedagogy or transformative pedagogy, there is bound to be, like any educational setting, there would be like affective states that would be provoked. So we wanted to really explore those affect and emotions, and specifically for the multilingual refugee learners who experience also other exclusionary practices, or they might experience hostility from the host community, who do experience hostility. So here we wanted to look at the affective and emotional responses of the students, their parents, and the teacher, and that was again more than a year after they experienced that. And we wanted to use sort of chat as an activity system to see how does emotion permeate through the different parts. I'm going to go through these actually quickly. We wanted here also, we used an additional framework, which was rightful presence, because we were working with refugee communities that are always in this perpetual liminality between like one space and another space. And with rightful presence, we look at, like critical justice and the politics of education sort of come to the front. And it allows the participants, both the teacher, the community, and to work together and go against like injustices, and to question who has the right to participate and who is excluded, and in what ways are we really validating our students and the teachers and their families' resources. We use collective memory work, which is like an interview technique where you ask people to remember what they have done. This was done with 8 students and their care givers. And for data analysis, there were different layers. First, we looked at explicit expression of emotional lived experiences. We did thematic analysis for there, and then we tried to sort of map them according to a chat analysis. So if we look first at the language of instruction as a mediating artifact, we have, like the students always saying, and their parents, everybody has challenges with English, even if it's only a little. They wouldn't say, oh, it's a big problem for us. In a way, they try to say that it's a problem, but not a big problem, because again, we feel that it has been internalized that we really have to learn the second language as important for our future. However, when they were talking about the translanguaging space and the how they engaged in YPAR, the students mentioned how they felt appreciated, validated, and safe. So these are some examples. One student said, you were the only teacher who made us feel like a friend. When we were frustrated, you will try to help us. Others would make us scared. So again, because it's a refugee population, there's lots of emotions that go around that. So the students really saw that there was a lot of feeling of being safe. They were happy to be heard, and to be heard without mentioning. They really mentioned that others would make them feel scared and anxious because they came from another country, and there's sort of the expectations that they are good in the second language, and like just this cycle of giving them those messages that the resources they bring are not good enough. Um, I- Finally, these are some just words from the moms. The moms said they were very happy because they felt that their students were taking ideas from them and from the teachers. So there was this sort of fluid exchange of ideas. And there were some unexpected connections. Like one mom mentioned how she's separated from the dad, and she really enjoyed the phone conversations when they did the interview, for example. And again, I have to say, this is more than a year after this happened. So them really remembering this is, we feel is powerful. I think someone has their, okay. Now to end, just to and my own sharing of our journey, we noticed that in addition to being such a valuable pedagogy, so other than being an ideology and a concept and a valuable pedagogy for learning, also translanguaging, in a translanguaging space, there was a lot of emotions that were explicit, vividly remembered, and pervasive in participant collections, both positive and negative emotions. And they varied across the different elements of the culture or the activity. So, for example, how they felt invited, how they felt honored and validated, and they this gave them more the confidence to share and to interact. But also in division of labor, there was this idea from the parents that they felt that they had a strong presence and in their children's education, and this sort of created those fluid and porous boundaries between science and students' lives. And there was also a lot of talk, I don't go too much into it, but there was a lot of talk about like the rules that constrain whether like how to register in the school, in the classroom itself, how they were treated. So again, there was a lot of emotions about those sort of logistic and constraining factors. As a conclusion, translanguaging space in context specifically like Lebanon that has a very, a colonial history, but also we have the refugee situation. I mean, there's lots of layers for security, everything. It enables learning and development through experiences that are both intellectual and agentic and affective. By honoring and leveraging multilingual learners and teachers, meaning making and resources, and their positive and negative aspect, because as we said, contradictions also are impetus for change. An inclusive translanguaging space is creative to collectively disrupt inequitable sociopolitical ideologies and practices. And science and teaching and learning is expanded towards also addressing the collective struggle and the strive for social justice by the students, be it like Lebanese students from lower socioeconomic strata, refugee students, but also typical Lebanese students who are like myself, who are with the message that our linguistic resources are less than, that Arabic and studying Arabic is something that is less than, other than something that we need to, that it's part of our identity. So ultimately, rightful presence is proclaimed by learners and communities of historically marginalized in schooling and societies. But again, not just because I think as a population, we're all marginalized in one way or another for any reason. So thank you for listening, and I look forward for our discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Salloum. Unfortunately, it looks like Dr. Charamba is unable to join at the moment. So we can start our open discussion. If anyone from the attendees has any questions for Dr. Suárez or Dr. Salloum, please feel free to ask them.
Can I cheat?
this is when-
Oh, sorry, Wendy, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say that I do have a question. So let me just say who I am. So I am a curriculum developer at the Lawrence Hall of Science. I work primarily on secondary science instructional materials. And because many of our materials are used nationally, those get reviewed by Ed Reports. And I'm curious about your reactions to their new MLL review tool, if you are familiar with that. Specifically, I'm interested in your thoughts about the criterion that requires instructional materials to include a separate scope and sequence that develops English language learning goals over time. So this is in addition to the science learning goals. I'm just curious if you have a reaction to that criterion.
Sarah, do you want to go first?
I just wanted to ask if Wendy can tell us more about because I'm not familiar with like things maybe that some features that you have noticed and
Well, I'm not sure that I'm understanding your question. I'm just it seems to me that this goal of having separate English language goals as a requirement throughout a science curriculum seems a little at odds with some of what you've spoken about today, where about the ability of students to use whatever language they need to communicate their understanding of science. So it seems like there's a tension there, and I don't know if I'm reading that wrong or just what your reactions are.
I mean, I agree that tensions are very much a part of when you're trying to take an idea, for example, like translanguaging and doing inquiry and learning like authentically, there's first a very basic tension between this and creating like a specific curriculum with very specific standards. So in a way, there's something first basic where you're trying to standardize something. It is going to it's going to take from the way that you notice others or recognize others. So in itself, this is actually part of the contradictions that we have or the paradoxes that actually we have in education in general. So yes, I do agree with that. We have been, you know, with my collaborators, we have been talking about like if, you know, it has to be something that comes out from the context itself, from the teachers and the students based on who they are and what they care about. So there has to be this aspect of also fluidity and flexibility and maybe porosity with defining what curriculum is. Does this make sense or?
I mean,
Well,
Would you like
I think
to
that
comment? Yeah.
was someone else going to respond?
Oh no,
Yeah.
go ahead, Wendy. Yeah. And I'll share, but yeah, I want to hear kind of
Well,
like what you have to say. So, yeah,
why don't you go ahead, Enrique?
Okay. Yeah, so I think that first I want to be sympathetic to like the project of trying to create national standards or national curricula that could be used broadly, especially in countries or nation states like, you know, the US or maybe even Lebanon, where like there is such a wide linguistic and cultural and ethnic diversity. I think that it is yeah, it is really hard to like be able to create something that can be adopted widely. And I do think that overall there is use for criteria through which we can look at the curricula or the standards that are out there and say, hey, this is good curriculum, this is high quality curriculum, we should be using this or not. So I want to start with that. And I think that, for instance, like Open Syed, which is a curriculum that's been developed in the United States with philanthropic funding to be able to create high quality science curriculum that is accessible for both primary and secondary schools for free. So like unlike a lot of curricula that are behind paywalls or are offered by publishers and are very expensive, the idea behind Open Syed or Open Science Education is that these curricula are freely available to anybody and everybody based on research. And the way that these came about was that a group of science education researchers and learning scientists came together and proposed some design specifications for the curricula. I was part of the design specification team that talked about kind of like translanguaging and languaging. And it's been really hard to see how iterations of Open Syed have not taken those design specifications into account. And I think that to your point, Wendy, and part of what we see reflected here in Ed Reports is that, as I was saying, as Sara and I were saying earlier, like science education is existing within a larger context, and it can be really difficult to make the case to administrators, school administrators, school building administrators, district administrators, like state, even just sort of like science leaders, around shifting the paradigm around language and languaging when they themselves have been are convinced that developing English is the only way through which, you know, children should be learning science, and not just science, but in general. I think that you know, since the return to in-person schooling in 2021 or 2022, what we have seen is that there has been an even higher decrease of instructional time for science because we are moving towards a back to basics. You know, like we've convinced ourselves that there is such a thing as like a pandemic learning gap, and that we need to be drilling and killing mathematics and ELA and English language arts and literacy, like even more so than before, because you know, like children are falling behind. So I think that this is creating an ecosystem where Ed Reports is maybe feeling the pressure to continue to evaluate a curriculum based on how, you know, kind of like a separate track for multilingual learners that really foregrounds English, because again, this is the only, this is just becoming the coin of the realm, you know, like, oh, I'm going to help you, whatever we do in other content areas, we're going to help the children develop English, we're going to help children develop literacy, because that's what's kind of like being valued right now. And I think to Sara's point, like there is a real tension, because I think that it's bumping up against the thing that we've been saying for the past, like, you know, hour or so, which is that is an outdated and old idea around thinking of bilingualism or multilingualism, not only in the science classroom, but in general, especially if it continues to marginalize the linguistic or practices or translanguaging practices of these students. I think it's a shame, but again, it doesn't surprise me. And I also want to be fair and say that there are people within science education who have a principled position for why teaching vocabulary is important, right? I mean, I think that Amelia Gottwal's Wenk with Tanya Wright, who have been part of the Open Syed in elementary school initiative, they've been doing this kind of like how to do literacy for bilingual students in a science classroom in early childhood for a while. And I think that Tanya Wright is very clear about, like, for her, it is important to teach the formalisms of academic or science talk. For instance, this is just one example, you know. So at any rate, all that to say that There are some real tensions. I think that we all have principled positions. I think that we would disagree with what we call justice and equity. And I think that for a lot of folks, I think reflected in the YET report's review criteria, for them, equity is to bring people into speaking English and being able to kind of like engage in the way that we, again, it's academic talk. To me, and I'm speaking for myself here, not Sarah, I also think that this is just part and parcel of how we have been pushed to back to basics because we think that there is something that we need to fix. I mean, but I'll stop there for now.
I have a question. Hi, my name is Sahar Alemi. I'm an assistant professor of STEM education at the University of Kentucky. And actually, I want to ask, I have two questions for you, Dr. Suárez, if possible. I'll go with the first one. I'll start. So in your presentation, you spoke about mechanistic explanation, and my research focused on scientific explanation. And research consistently shows that throughout K through 12, teachers and students use a lot of anthropomorphic or teleological language. You know, it's not uncommon in elementary classroom to see teachers saying that, you know, molecules in a solid want to stay too close together and so forth. From your perspective, could this unintentionality with translanguaging reinforce some kind of these patterns by making them, you know, seem more human-like or more natural? And if so, how do you think we might design instruction to preserve its benefits? Because it's really useful. I loved that from a physics perspective, the tension with the ting and the tongue, that a 9-year-old can think about that. But I also fear that they would associate that with these objects actually making sounds or having some reaction that is beyond the physical science limit.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And Sarah, I also invite you to kind of like, you know, chime in if you also have thoughts here. And I see my colleague and dear friend, Lama Jaber, is also on the call. So Lama, you know, feel free to unmute yourself and jump in if you would like. I think that I hear your concern, and I'm gonna channel my mentor and colleague, David Hammer, and say that I'm really not that worried about, at least at the elementary level, I'm really not that worried about the possibility of teleologic language or kind of like anthropomorphizing and thinking of to explain the how and the why things are happening. I think for me, I mean, and this is some of the work that David Hammer with Andy Albee and Aisha Gupta did for a while, of just sort of like recognizing that even physicists are able to use different mental models for thinking about what's happening with the world. And also there's a beautiful ethnographic account by Jeannie Ox about physicists who were thinking about putting themselves in the role of a particle to think about what the space around them was and how they would be interacting with the space as a way of trying to do new theoretical physics in ways that they couldn't kind of like see just through the equations. So I think that what we see is that people have complex models and for making sense of the world around them. And in a way, people know when those models, I mean, people know, but it's also part of our work as science educators and help them realize the limitations of those models and say, like, this is as far as you can go with this, you know, like you are not able to predict or explain kind of like what's happening if you stay from this perspective, you would need to go beyond that. So, you know, in the case of Ting Tang Tong, or in the case of the electricity moving through the circuit, it's like as a physicist, I know that it's not one electron that is traveling all the way from the battery, like all around. Like electricity is it's a much more complex and abstract, like physical phenomenon. But at that level, I'm okay with having a toy model where electricity flows like water, to be able to explain like what's happening to it and how it's constrained or expanded, because to me, being able to think about it from our perspectives builds a foundation from which deeper conceptual understanding can be developed later on if necessary. so part of like that playfulness of the language or the usefulness of the language is again kind of like getting at that foundational conceptual understanding. And then later on, if I mean, part of what we did in that classroom was say, you know, like if you were to talk to somebody else who didn't have the instrument in front of you, maybe saying ting tang tong won't be that helpful. So how would you be able to communicate your understanding to somebody who's not in the room? And this is where kind of like that abstraction is helpful. But again, not limiting the models or the frameworks or the resources that they have available to them, because all of those are important. And again, in my mind, is that heterogeneity, that variation, that difference that can really be helpful. So I'm not that worried about it, but I hear your concern, and I do think, especially at the secondary level, it's important to kind of like continue to hold on to the question of like, is this limiting in some kind of way? I don't know, like Sara,
And in
oh, sorry.
Yes, sorry. Thank you so much for that. And in philosophy of science, it's interesting because philosophers do talk about teleology and how physicists and scientists use teleology, but they are physicists and scientists. We're not afraid that they're gonna do the or have misconceptions. They're not gonna think that actually the plant wants to try to go to sunlight. But I do agree that teachers, just like any other analogy and model, have to really explicitly talk about the limitations of what they're presenting. Now, do they do that or not? Whether they do that or not is another thing. But yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and just if you don't mind, like 10 seconds to add to that, I think that part of it is that the way that we do science in school is actually not reflective of those kinds of like creative, flexible ways of thinking. I think that so we have committed ourselves so much to like this canonical set of like principles and knowledges that limit ourselves. So like, what would it look like to be playful, and how can we allow ourselves to just very much like a science? And I think that this is where the NRC framework and the NGSS really present an opportunity of that playfulness. We're, you know, sometimes we're terrified, or sometimes we feel really committed. Like you said, we want to do right by them. We don't want to send them into the world with quote unquote misconceptions, you know, however we choose to define that. Again, I don't quite believe in them. Spiritually, I don't quite believe in misconceptions. But yeah, but I don't know. But I think that, but what would it look like for us to give ourselves that space to be playful and flexible and creative?
Thank you.
I do have a question if no one else has one. So if we want to compare both the Lebanese and the US context, I think that in Lebanon, we do find a lot of teachers that are multilingual and that are able to kind of address the translanguaging of students and properly respond to it in the classroom. But maybe in the US context, that there will be some like monolingual teachers. So how can we specifically, maybe in the teacher education context, how can we better support monolingual teachers and help them kind of respond to the translanguaging of students and support it later on in classrooms? And that could be a question for both of our presenters.
Well, first, I want to say something, because this is actually also research we're doing now. To support translanguaging, it's important to think about it also ideologically. Even if you're multilingual, that doesn't automatically mean that you, in a way, support it or see that that's the best way to do it, because we know that, you know, like for example, just the example about the vocabulary now. Some teachers, they could be multilingual, but they are multilingual themselves, but they truly believe that part of their job and this is part of doing their job well and serving their students, is focusing on being a glorified vocabulary teacher. It's a stance that they have that sometimes it is so that stance is definitely can be affected by being multilingual and maybe living in different places, experiencing different things, but it doesn't automatically mean that. So I feel that even if you are, you know, even if you're not multilingual themselves, when you start thinking of the, you know, the various ways we communicate as the powerful, you know, like a powerful aspect of what we do and how we come to learn the world, then in a way you find a way to so we have, like, one of the interviews now we've done with a teacher here in the US, like they saw this as a joyful and interesting challenge when they have students from so many different linguistic backgrounds. They enjoyed really finding ways to come to understand who they are and to give them the opportunities to have different ways to communicate together. So the teacher did not really have to understand their languages to do that. It was more like a realization or being themselves in a way convinced that this is a better way of working with the students and encouraging their learning and their well-being in the science classroom. So that's how I think about it, is how do we, and I think that this is how Dr. Suárez sort of ended is how do we support our in-service and pre-service teachers as they start contemplating the stance of how are they making sense of their students' multiple communicative repertoires, and including gestures, working with materials. You know, how do they see them? How do they frame them? How do they characterize them? And then how do they deploy them for, you know, to serve their students?
Thank you.
Mic drop, Sara. Like, I think that you said it beautifully. I think that it's really, yeah, it's important.
Do we have any other questions, comments from speakers? Yes, we have Tamer Amin. Go ahead.
Hello, this is Tamer Amin at the American University of Beirut. Thank you both. I mean, I really enjoyed the presentations. Hi, Sara. Nice to see you. I guess I just wanted to, this is a question for Sara, I think, but I think it has broader implications, but specifically about kind of the ideologies of parents and teachers when you start to engage with parents and teachers related to translanguaging strategies. And you made the point, you know, that as is certainly the case in the Lebanese context and other places around the world, where a language like English is such high status and opens doors professionally and economically and all of that. So I guess my question is, if one takes an empowerment perspective, you take a point of view where you're respecting the angle of the families, of the teachers, and where they come from, and you take that very seriously, it does come up against the core tenet, if you will, of a translanguaging approach to instruction, or at least it can be perceived as such if, you know, we go back to the earlier discussion that the sort of the foreign language is not being really focused on as something that needs to be developed, or what's focused on is the sense making, etc. So, I mean, while I endorse all of those ideas, I wonder how to reconcile that, and how does one deal with that tension? So I guess in your work, that would be one of those contradictions that would emerge from the chat perspective. But how does one resolve it, as my question? So I was wondering what your thoughts on that. Thank you.
So thank you for that question. And actually, I may at the end quote, actually, I will quote you now for something you said to me a long time ago, that it's not unreasonable after 12 years of school for learners to develop all their linguistic resources, be it standard Arabic, the international language, and also learning science in a profound way. Again, we've been, talking about this, and we have actually started. Uh, we, we all believe that teachers, parents, and all of us, we all want to do what's best for the students, but also we want something that's tangible and concrete, that, shows us that there are some, there are some outcomes, like talking about, the tensions with the standards and the criteria. There are specific outcomes that, or an object and an outcome that has been realized. So before in Lebanon, we start something and then something else happen, it stops us. But we were doing a really a professional development experience, where the focus was to work with not just the science teachers, the language teachers, the Arabic teachers, or math teachers, is, about how can we create a space where in the science classroom you would have material, and in other classrooms where they are engaging in this meaning making that is multimodal and multilinguistics, but also they are purposefully developing those different and expanding those resources. And I think that this is very important and essential when we talk about translanguaging in general, but in science education, is because we do have a lot of, I think there's a comment by Dr. Suárez also about like the, like non-Western science or their own heritage in trying to understand the world. So creating that professional development and curriculum experience, I think, with the teachers, and them trying it out themselves, them like co-constructing it, and them trying it out themselves, and seeing that, yes, there is going to be an added value to it, which is, again, that's an object of study that we have to keep on studying, and also revising our own assumptions and our own ideologies. We don't have it figured out yet, of course, but I think that this is a way to go, because once in one of those meetings we had, so this was work done with Dr. Boujaudi, where we had like the standard Arabic term within the materials they were exploring, and this created such a rich discussion with the teachers, that we really saw that there was a lot of opportunities for the teachers to start thinking about, yeah, so why shouldn't we always also have some standard Arabic materials in the science? But this is also going to this is also going to support our students, that important linguistic resource for them to become better at it. Because we know that actually standard Arabic in Lebanon is probably suffering more than English. That, like, as a formal language, it's being like a lot of students don't like to learn, like it might actually serve both. So, and I think if we're able to do more research and show that this is of added values, then yeah, different community and stakeholders will start warming up to the idea that it's important.
Thank you very much.
I'll add a couple of resources in the chat here in a second. One is from Math Education, from a colleague from UT Austin, about exploring multilingualism within a family, and how having, I think that the title of the paper, if I remember, is like, like when my mom speaks Spanish, it helps me learn math. And then also, like, there's really interesting research coming out of sociolinguistics around family language policy, specifically by Kendall King, and thinking about kind of like what happens in these sort of like multi-family, multinational, multilingual contexts. I think, to like add to like Sara's contribution here, I didn't present this work, but some of the analysis that I'm doing is in an out-of-school time learning with like Latinx families, and thinking about multilingualism for STEM, or kind of like robotics and other kinds of projects. And what we see is that there are some really interesting family language policies at play, where some families are very intentional about keeping almost monoglossic separation of languages, where there is like Spanish for one purpose and English for one purpose. And then there are families that are able to Translanguaging more freely because they have a different kind of family language policy. And I'm not going to compare them and say that one is better than the other, but at some point, some families have decided that existing in a kind of like a multilingual context, even for themselves as parents or adults, is actually productive. And we see that showing up in how they engage in the practices of robotics construction or computer programming. And they use these similar semiotic resources that Sara mentioned around multiple languages, gesturing, drawings, to be able to collaboratively engage in meaning making and create something in ways that, other families that have more, I would say, maybe conservative family language policies are able to engage like differently. And I think that, again, part of it is in the context that we live in, like if you're feeling like your language is under threat because you migrated or because it's being, you're being colonized, or kind of like that colonial presence is still there, then you're going to make different kinds of decisions. But maybe it's a question of, again, kind of like asking ourselves, as Sara was saying, like what's possible, what are we missing, and yeah, and I don't know, it just continues to like hurt me to hear about the case of Lebanon and what you're saying, Sara, because like again, as I said in the chat at some point, it's 2,000 years of important science that the Western canon has forgotten, right? Like we decided that there's this science siesta between 500 BCE and 1500 CE, as if the Renaissance and the Enlightenment had happened out of nowhere, and people just forget about all of the beautiful contributions that Arab and Persian scientists and natural philosophers made for 2,000 years. And now that the point where English is seen as the language of science instead of Arabic seen as the language of science, because that's what kept it going and contributed for so long.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Do we have more questions or comments? Anyone?
Can I talk? Am I
Yes,
audible?
of course.
Am I audible?
Yeah, we can
Yeah,
hear
go
you.
ahead, Narendra.
Yeah. Basically, let me appreciate the efforts of NARST and the organizer, Professor Kisley. I think whenever we are discussing this language issue in the context of science, I think many related things will coming in this context. One is that the language, whether take an example of in our country, India, we have a multilingual country, Hindi, Marathi, English, and then other provinces, they have their own language. Apart from that, even because India is a vast country, again, even in after some districts, there is also a little bit difference between the languages. That point is also there. Another point is that the language of a teacher, from where the teachers are coming, their own language, that is also one issue. Then the important thing is the academic discourse language, the instructional material language. And then the science also has their own language. So considering this, all this, you can say, little bit complicated connections of all these things. Sometimes I get confused how the learners are making sense of all that sort of the concept or whatever the things written in the textbook of the science, and what sort of teacher training, just now mentioned someone, what sort of teacher training or teacher educations we supposed to impart, that is also another point. And let me thanks Professor Amin. I am very it's my honor and pleasures to see you in this online meeting. Thank you. My question is very clear that it's not a simple issue. It's a very complicated things, and we don't know how things are. The resources, whatever the resources you are talking about, lot of resources we have. But again, the resources, who has written the resources? What are their background? What are their language? I don't know exactly, but these things are there, and many solutions we are trying to resolve this issue in the context of sense making. Uh, that's my point to share with you. Anyone can reply, or anyone can give some inputs on that. Thank you. I think Professor Henry, you have to
Would you like to go, Enrique, or?
I think, yeah, I appreciate the question, and I think it's for me at least, it's a complex one, if not a complicated one. And I think to me it brings us back a little bit to Wendy's question about reports and how do we think about these criteria in terms of national curricula. I hope I hope that the answer is not that we should take a provincial approach, and by that I mean that I don't think that the solution is for every state, however we choose to define that, or every region or every school or every district to define or create their own curricula or create their own resources to meet their needs. I do think that in this day and age, that is very resource intensive, and it's probably better for us to support each other and find ways of maybe adapting the curricula that exists beyond creating it for ourselves. But you're right. I mean, I think that who creates the curriculum is a really important question. I think that where is the center of power? Who has access to it? You know, like, is it one organization that is creating curricula for like the whole country, and whose ways of knowing and speaking and valuing are being privileged in that? And I think that yeah, I don't know. I think that maybe part of the solution in terms of that is decentering one organization or two, or like where that locus of power is, to try and like fragment it a little bit, a bit more, finding ways of maybe taking kind of like what's available and again retrofitting it and adapting it to serve your local context and your local languages, as you were saying. I mean, you're right. The linguistic diversity within South Asia is incredible. Like not just the official languages, but also the regional languages and dialects that are spoken. So like, and we need to honor those as well. And at the same time, as Sara was saying earlier, like recognizing that, and Tamara was saying earlier, like there is power in speaking those like sanctioned languages in terms of access, but we shouldn't just kind of like stay with that, but challenge it as well. And again, in terms of teacher education, I think that, you know, Sara said it best earlier, but part of our job is to like develop those dispositions and capacities within future teachers to be able to be flexible, to be able to be responsive, especially in what some people call here in the United States like hyper-diverse linguistic settings, where we have 50 languages, 60 languages represented in one school district. We will never have one person who speaks all of them, or maybe even the resources to hire translators for every single one. But maybe if we are able to develop ways for translanguaging to be the norm and for the multilingualism to be the norm, and not just logo-centric spoken and written word being the only way through which we can communicate with each other, then we can create spaces we can collaborate and be with each other in multiple forms of communication, and that's okay. I'll stop there. Sara, what would you add?
I think, I mean, also thinking about my own experience as an educator is, yeah, developing this awareness also that I don't think we are, I think this is another tension that, you know, in teacher education, we have so many things we want to do within like a limited period of time. And in a way, if we think about it, it's really such a developmental practice to teach. It requires time and thinking and experience and mentorship and interactions. So, but yeah, like just from my thinking about my own experiences, it wasn't like a bit. It took me time to develop this language sort of awareness that would eventually, would help me think about dispositions and translanguaging and all those. So in a way, I think like we hope to maybe like plant some seeds and then maybe create some ways for this for the teachers to enable, like some structures, experiences for them to be responsive, just like part of their development journey, sort of. But it is very complex and very hard. But then,
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
everything worth doing probably is.
Thank you, everyone. I don't think we will have more time to take any more questions today. It was such an enriching discussion. Thank you to our speakers and to all of our attendees. Hopefully, translanguaging will continue to be researched and leveraged in science classroom to support learning and honor students' identities. Also, I want to thank NARST and the International Committee, and hopefully we can have more of these discussions later on as well. Thank you, everyone.
For organizing. Thank you for it.
Yeah,
Bye.
Christelle, you rocked it. Thank you so much for putting this
Yeah.
together.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work, and yeah, especially as a grad student. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Be
Bye.
well, be safe, everyone. And Sara, like I really want to reach out and chat some more. I love your presentation, and I think that you're bringing some really interesting dimensions of the experience of children and families together that I want to learn more about. So I'll be reaching out for sure.
Thank you so much. Again, you're
Yeah.
always inspiring. I have to always add that.
We're in this together.